Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 50. That's right, 50 of the Citrix Session podcast. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got my guests with me, starting with Bill Sutton, my normal compadre. Bill, how's it going?
Going well, Andy. Hard to believe we've done 50 of these now.
When you're having fun, it just flies by, right?
That's right.
And I mean that as dorky as it sounds, and as genuine as it is.
Same here.
We also have with us our new guest host, Ben Rogers, who's a local sales engineer for Citrix here in the Charlotte market. Ben, how's it going?
Good. I'm doing well today. Glad to be on.
So, Ben, you joined us last week, and we put you on the spot and made you answer a tough question, and you had some clarification around the different offerings as of now with Citrix Virtual App and Desktop Service.
Yes, that is correct. And I will tell the listeners that if I say something wrong, that I will go back and correct myself. So Andy asked me what the biggest differences were between advanced and premium Citrix Virtual App services and Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktop services. And so I went back and looked. My initial comment was I thought it had to do something with support. But as I said that, I kind of felt like that wasn't right. So it absolutely has nothing to do with support whatsoever. But the differences are in a few features that you get with premium that you don't get with advanced. Director Premium, advanced app layering, some SD-WAN integration. And then this is a big one for me when I was in healthcare, session recording. That does not come with advanced, but it does come with premium. If you need more information, I've given Andy a link. Hopefully he'll make it public to everybody that you can see a full feature set and how all these things line up. So I just wanted to make that correction for everybody.
All right, that's great, Ben. And you guys have been immediately after the call said, "Oh, I don't think that was right. I need to clarify that." And we let it ride in the podcast. But I like that about Ben. Right? He's something's not quite exactly right, and he just won't rest till it is. I worked with Ben as a customer at one point, and that man works tirelessly to make sure things are done correctly and how they should be. All right, Tim O'Brien. Tim is a customer success engineer at Citrix, based, I think, in Illinois, but he can clarify that. And Tim wrote a recent blog, Citrix Tips, local host cache for Citrix Virtual App and Desktops. Tim, how's it going?
I'm doing well, Andy. Thanks.
I appreciate you joining us today and going over this blog. Where are you located?
So I'm located in Chicago, so Illinois, like you said.
Okay, great. You guys, we talk about weather a lot in the beginning of these podcasts. You guys ready for what's coming?
I think so. It's cooling off, but should be hopefully nice for a little bit before it starts, snowing and all that for 3 months.
Are you a native of that area?
I grew up in Wisconsin. I've been in Chicago now for 15 years or so.
Okay, so you're used to it. You know what's coming, and it's just you kind of roll with it, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Well, what we'll do here is we'll go through kind of the sections, and Ben and Bill and myself will chime in and ask some questions along the way, and we'll just try to get out of what you've got covered here in the blog. Anything you want to add prior to jumping into this?
No, we can go ahead and get started.
All right, great. So, Tim, you covering in the beginning here, local host cache as it relates to virtual app and desktop. Is this just for the service, or is this for the on-prem, or both that we'll be covering here?
So the blog talks about the service offering. Obviously, local host cache is available for the customer managed control plane as well.
Okay. So as we go through here, if there's a reason to call out one versus the other, that would be great. Okay, you want to start by this nice little write-up here that talks about what local host cache is. For some of the old timers, it'll be a no-brainer what it is, but for some of the newer folks, it'll be enlightening.
Yeah, so the local host cache is a feature of the virtual apps and desktop service that allows for service continuity with when there's a lack of connectivity to the control plane. So users will still be able to launch their apps and desktops, in those cases where there's a disruption. And then existing connections would, continue to function as normal because the cloud connectors aren't in the path for those connections, in these scenarios.
Now, as that relates to people connecting, is that for internal only connections or connections through the gateway or both at this point?
So this would be for connections that are both, internal only or through gateway with a customer managed access tier. So your customers managing their own Citrix gateway and storefront.
Okay. So basically this is really just a situation where you can't get to the Citrix control plane either because, and more than likely because there's internet connectivity issues or because the Citrix environment is unreachable for some random reason.
That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, Tim.
Go ahead, Ben.
I've got a couple of questions. So I'm 1 year in as a sales engineer, and this has been a hot topic this past year. Can you tell us what the difference between the DDC and the cloud connector is? Because I've heard some conversations in my group where the cloud connector really acts as an unmanaged DDC in some cases. And could you explain that for us, and kind of that would probably help our crowd us to understand of what is the role as the cloud connector and how it kind of goes in this equation where it takes over some of the DDC role if you have an outage.
Sure. So the cloud connector for the service offering tends to be a proxy, for lack of a better term, for the delivery controllers that are in the Citrix Cloud Control Plane that Citrix manages. So functions that the delivery controller does in a CVAD on-premises deployment or customer managed control plane. So the brokering functions where storefront communicates with the delivery controller as a broker. The cloud connector is doing that role. And in the blog we're kind of talking specifically about that function, but it's also handling a lot of the other functions that the delivery controller would typically do. Including, authentication, talking to Active Directory and that sort of thing, hosting connectivity, so connecting with a hypervisor platform to do power management, and the secure ticket authority. So if your gateway needs to connect to an STA, it's connecting to the cloud connector in these deployments. So a good host of functions, a lot of which came from the delivery controller and in the customer managed releases.
Hey, Tim, I have a question for you on this kind of topic related, and maybe you can't answer this now. Citrix finding a way to make the access layer less tied into maybe more resilient, I guess would be the right word for it. Not that it's not resilient now, but it's certainly dependent on these connectors as well as the Azure environment. Is what you guys are working on there something you can talk about at this point, or we save that for a later podcast?
I would save the particulars for a later podcast, but there's certainly efforts in motion to get additional resiliency for the Citrix managed access tier. Yeah,
that'd be great. Okay. All right. Well, let's jump into the tips here. Tips for using local host cache. Your first one says all connectors to which VDAs register need to communicate with storefront deployment. You want to cover that one?
Yeah, so that's a kind of a key area where customers will want to kind of double check and make sure that they've got this set up. So when the connectivity of the control plane is lost and the environment goes into local host cache mode, the talking to storefront is, as it talks about in the blog, is a prerequisite for connectors to know that they need to go into localhost cache mode and have VDAs re-register with the connector that's elected as the broker during the outage, so that all of the VDAs re-register with the secondary brokering service on that connector. So if you have VDAs that are registered with a connector that's not tied into a storefront deployment, the VDAs will stay registered there, but the localhost cache through storefront won't be aware of those VDAs, so users won't be able to connect to them.
So, Tim, is it the connector that realizes that the connectivity is lost, or is it the storefront tapping him on the shoulder and telling him that something's gone wrong?
So the connector will be the piece that'll tell the VDAs to re-register. And like I said, it talking to storefront is a prerequisite for that to know to go into LHC mode.
Okay. Hey, Bill, any questions on this part?
It's there's a timeout, right, Tim? There's a certain amount of time before which the LHC goes into whatever mode it is. You mentioned LHC mode, I guess, before the connector goes into LHC mode.
Yeah, the timeout is 60 seconds.
Yeah, I saw here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's earlier in the blog. We skimmed over that part, but yeah, 60 seconds, and then it'll go into LHC mode.
There it is. Yeah.
Can you force a VDA to re-register?
So there are a few manual processes to put a cloud connector in LHC mode, which would cause that re-registration. I'm going to talk about that kind of at the end of the blog in the testing section. But as part of the initial setup and the validation for a customer's deployment, you'd want to make sure that all connectors are tied into a storefront deployment, because they're we'll get into the thing I was about to talk about in the next section, I guess.
Well, let's jump into this next bullet. The next bullet, it starts off with the storefront configuration matters. Let's cover this section here.
Right. So here, storefront when going into a localhost cache scenario, each zone, which is a resource location in a cloud deployment, they're analogous, but so each zone is managed independently with storefront. So there's two options to be able to make sure that you can launch resources across different zones or different resource locations. So that the first method that we talk about is if you're on storefront 1912 cumulative update 1 or later, that you can use the storefront advanced health check feature. So that adds some pieces into storefront that allow it to enumerate resources across resource locations, so that you have access to all of the resources in your deployment. And then the second option, if that's not an option, you can use storefront to set each resource location as a separate site, and then use the site aggregation feature to make sure that resources that are available in multiple resource locations are deduplicated. So users have access to all of their published apps and desktops.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just got off a call with a healthcare conglomerate, and some of our historical usage of on-prem Citrix virtual app and desktop, where we were masking objects with multiple storefront environments, so that you you didn't see duplication in a scenario where you had access to both. In fact, Ben used to run an environment that had that set up. Hey, Ben, any questions or comments on this piece?
No, I just think that this is neat. I mean, this part right here where it talks about the connectors needing to connect with each other, that kind of makes sense, because you think if you had an outage, you might have something going wrong with the cloud, but that might not take your on-prem environment. And that on-prem environment could be across multiple locations. So for that storefront to be able to reach across those multiple locations makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting when we get to the point here in a minute where we start talking about how to test this when you don't have the real scenario. That's going to be key, I'm sure. Tim, your next section talks about don't forget about remote access.
Right. So here we're talking about using your Citrix ADC. It's, as you guys know, it's got a lot of functions with the use of monitors to be able to do in-depth health checks of services. So here, leveraging the ADC to use that Citrix XD DDC monitor, I believe it is, versus using like a ping or a TCP check to validate secure ticket authority. So when you go into the local host cache mode, that broker that's elected as the primary broker that all the VDAs register with becomes your secure ticket authority using the secondary brokering service on the cloud connector. So doing that health check is important because the other cloud connectors are available, right? But from a TCP or a ping standpoint, but the service may not be available from actually being able to generate a STA ticket.
So I'm curious to kind of, maybe this should wait until the end, but can you kind of give me a sense of what you would recommend in a situation where you've got the Citrix Cloud Service, an on-premises environment, sitting in a colo or a data center with two cloud connectors and a storefront and an ADC, and then they've got two cloud connectors in Azure. What are they, from a simplistic standpoint, what would they need to configure on the storefront side to enable the functionality you're describing in here at a high level?
Okay. Yeah. So in the scenario you're describing, you've got two resource locations, likely. I mean, you could configure it as a single resource location, but in most cases, you would set them up as separate resource locations being, in different data centers.
Right.
So each of the two resource locations, you'd have both connectors defined in storefront.
Right.
So either as a single site in 1912 CU1 or later with advanced health checks, or to have it set as independent sites in the storefront configuration, and do any deduplication you need through the site aggregation feature. And then you would have each of those probably, if they have local ADCs set up that are relying on them, they're probably going to the local storefront for STAs. So you'd have potentially load balance VIP set up on your ADC, or connections to each of your STAs individually, right? With the Citrix XD DDC monitor to do the health checks and be able to determine whether up or down. Then you'd have each of your connectors that are tied into a storefront deployment, which we said was a requirement, and we'd have the health checks, and we'd have the appropriate storefront configuration so that users would be able to see all their resources.
Okay. So you said something in here about the STA being only active on the LHCs, or the connectors which become LHCs, so that's not available on the non-elected connectors. How do we determine? We just basically set up all of them as STAs, and then it would just pick the one that was active, I presume.
Right. So if you had all of your connectors defined as STAs,
right, which is typically what we would do.
One that's elected will be the one that's active.
Yeah, the other one will just show down, presumably.
Right.
Okay.
That was great. That would have been a great whiteboarding moment for those listening.
It would.
Certainly something this group can do for you if you would like to reach out and have those conversations. That's where the consulting kicks in. That's what we do. All right. Tim, the next section talks about once considerations above are addressed, there are a few other key factors worth confirming. And the first one talks about connector sizing. Let's cover that.
Sure. So the key thing there is just to understand that when you go into LHC mode, that local database, the Windows local DB, only uses a single socket. So depending on how you set up your VMs, you want to make sure you've got the appropriate amount of processing cores on the one socket to be able to handle the load that you're throwing at it. So, we've referenced a couple different configurations there. So a single socket with 4 cores or 2 socket with 3 cores, which are common configurations with customers. And then there's some more detail that talks about that from the product documentation. But ultimately, you want to make sure that you've got the capability to run that local DB with a single socket to be able to handle the workload you throw at it when it goes into LHC mode.
Right. Okay. And then the next one talks about resource location sizing. Is that on the same line of conversation?
Yep. Yeah. So it's just understanding, how many resources you have in a single resource location and how they're registering with the connector. And there's some, published guidance there to reference linked in the blog.
And then the next bullet talks about pooled desktops and jumps into power management. How about that part?
Yep. So with the pooled desktops, normally when you, as a user, you log in, you get one of the desktops in the pool, you use it, and when you log off, the machine will reboot. And then when you're going to work in LHC mode, if you reboot and you don't have the ability to do power management because you're in LHC mode, the desktop wouldn't be available for users. So you'd want to set the machines to be able to allow users to log on without having to reboot in LHC mode. It's a site level setting that you can set via PowerShell and the referenced in the blog. It obviously doesn't take into account what you had talked about a few weeks ago on the podcast about power management in LHC mode, but.
So I guess I'm confused. Why in LHC mode would I not have power management? Did I miss that part?
So when you go into LHC mode, you lose connectivity to the control plane. So the control plane can't tell your connector to tell your hypervisor to start or shut down machines.
Okay.
And there's no local logic that runs the power management functions in the outage mode currently.
Yeah. Okay, so that may be something you guys are coming out with, but that's really good to point out here. And then, again, we'll go back to something that we'll expose during the testing, whether you've got it right or not. Bill, Ben, any questions or comments on these two topics we've covered so far?
Nothing from me.
I mean, my only just comment is that, I'm glad I'm on this podcast because when you first install these connectors, you think, oh, this is just my gateway to the internet. I never realized the importance of these things, specifically in an outage situation. So very interesting that the cloud connectors take over so much of this functionality.
Yeah, and there's just so much to know, right, about what these things do. These are extremely important pieces of the equation that are sometimes just taken as, I don't want to say you were taking it trivially, but they do. They get stood up and everybody just assumes they just do their job, and they do, but they also need to be prepared when they're called upon to do the control plane's job, which is really what we're covering here.
Yeah, like this connector sizing, for example. I didn't specifically know that you needed to be aware of the socket sizing. But imagine you go into an outage mode and these things get elected as LHC, and then they start having problems communicating. Now you're going to be chasing that problem now. So again, just good little tidbits to know how to really get these things optimized so that you can deal with these situations and not have to be dealing with it while you're in the middle of it.
Yeah, these things are sitting around twiddling their thumbs, and all of a sudden they're called on to step into action, and they've got a lot to do. And Ben, you're highlighting the best thing about this podcast. You learn, Bill learns, I learn. Sometimes even the person doing the podcast learns a little something different. That's why we do it and why we share it with the world. Hopefully people are listening. Tim, this next section talks about monitoring. You want to cover that?
Sure. So there's some key event log notes from the connector that you see that talk about when the connector's detected there's an issue and gone into LHC mode, or seeing that your LHC mode is getting updates that are important when you both are validating that your configuration is working as expected, as well as being able to see during an outage what the status is, and when it's gone to LHC mode and when it's reverted back to the primary brokering service when it's recovered, right? So the key things with monitoring are just to see, be able to see when you can detect an outage, and to be able to validate that it's working as expected. And that kind of touches or gets into the last part of the blog that talks about how to test and validate. So
yeah, I love that you called this out, right? Anytime someone can tell me exactly what I'm looking for in the specific log I'm looking for it in, and it's one of the Windows logs or one of the system, well, I shouldn't say system, but one of the logs available in the event viewer, that makes it super easy. It's not buried in some text log somewhere. This is great. I'm glad you called this out.
Amen.
Okay, we finally gotten to this moment where we beat people over the head with the testing bat. Tim, why is it important we test this?
Well, it's good to validate that it works as expected, prior to there being an outage, rather than, an outage comes up and then you have user disruption because something, isn't set right, or could be set more optimally or sized more appropriately for your environment and your requirements. So, it's important to, probably, during your build phase to do that, make sure before it's in production, and obviously continue to validate that it's going to work as expected, so you avoid any impacts to your users.
Yeah, I mean, so testing is not foolproof, but we got to do it, and we got to do the best we can at it, and then we'll see what happens when the real world outage happens. Hopefully we're prepared. If not, it won't be for lack of trying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Andy, I think this ought to be part of people's disaster recovery plans. These steps that he's got listed here, I mean, as they're doing their disaster testing, this needs to be part of their disaster testing. So as you have customers ask for this, you might have to remind them that, hey, you've got to put this into practice with your DR testing.
Yeah, I'm looking at this, and Bill and I probably need to have a conversation, but this conversation should be part of every implementation we do around Citrix cloud services, and how we implement this and how we test it should be part of our normal consulting methodologies. And if customers choose not to implement this or be aware of it or test it, that's something they need to make a conscious decision of. This is extremely valuable to.
I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the key things here is customers understanding that to enable this functionality currently, they really need to have storefront and ADC in their, on premises. I'm looking at some of the notes here, and it doesn't currently support the workspace. So we want to make sure that where this is a concern, and then we need to make sure we architect it appropriately.
Yeah, Bill, we probably want to socialize this with our sales engineers and make sure they put this as part of their scoping conversations with customers.
Yeah.
So, Tim, with that, I think we've reached the end, but I want to thank you. This is great for us, great for the listeners, great for our customers. It's definitely things that we need to be aware of and making part of our conversations. This is excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's good discussion. Good topic to have customers look over and validate that they're leveraging all the resiliency capabilities that they have, and that if there is a disruption to their connectivity to control plane, that they're appropriately covered by their access tier.
So Tim, what's next? Do you have another blog that we should be waiting on to come out?
Well, we've been, doing what we can to be proactive with our customers, reach out and, touch on things that are in the blog and validate configurations, which, has been helpful. And then obviously customers can continue to work with, their partners and with us at Citrix to validate these items. That's part of what our customer success management team does for our customers that have service subscriptions. Clear some of those technical items and validate configuration. And then, for me, on this topic, I know we're working with our product management team to get a little bit more down in the weeds information out to our customers through TechZone. So hope that gets released soon.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I appreciate that. I'll be using this. I've got a customer success call later today, and I'll make sure I share this with them. This is very valuable. I appreciate your time. Thank you for jumping on with us.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Bill and Ben.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben, before we let you go, anything that you want to share with us before we adjourn here?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to be on today, and very interesting blog, and I was glad I participated. I learned a few things that I myself have to go back to a few customers and go, let's kind of discuss if this happens. What is your mechanism for making sure that you stay up and running? So I appreciate it.
Bill, anything on your side?
Yeah, I would echo what Ben said, but also I read through the blog a couple of times, once a week ago and then once this morning, and reading it is one thing, but having the clarification that really resulted from everybody on this call is key. So it kind of creates an example of how the discussion around the blog really helps to elaborate and clarify some of the things that were confusing to me.
Yeah, I think the reality of this podcast, and we've probably said it 50 times now, 50 episodes, that this is another great way to get the information out. Almost nobody has time to sit around and read all the blogs and consume them all and do the research that would go into consuming them. So I appreciate you guys joining. So I guess with that, we'll call it a podcast, and we'll do it again a different day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast. Podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.